Where do you want me to? Hello. I'm going to introduce our speaker. We have Sam Burton from University of California, Berkeley. Sam is actually an alum of UW, did his undergraduate here. And so it's great to have you back. And Sam's going to talk to us about his topic, reduction, identification for models of locomotion, emerging system theory, neuromechanics. Thank you, Sam.
Great. Thanks very much, Linda. And thanks, everybody, for coming this beautiful Seattle winter morning. I really enjoyed being back in town. So as Linda said, I'm going to talk about some of my work on specifically dealing with reduction and identification for locomotion and what I think of as an emerging systems theory for neuromechanics. So the motivation for this is that we will inevitably build autonomous machines that pervade our world. These will take the form of robotic butlers and laborers, of intelligent infrastructure and automated surgeons, and of assistive devices that enhance our natural ability and mitigate disability. And the examples I put up here fall under three broad research areas that I work in: robotics, cyber-physical systems, and neuromechanics. So robotics concerns itself with programming matter to do useful work. Cyber-physical systems deals with the interaction between networked control systems in the physical world. And neuromechanics focuses on the interaction between a nervous system with an environment through musculoskeletal structures, or the body. There's already been tremendous progress in each of these areas, even in just the last 10 years. And the outlook for future research is very bright. In robotics, we've seen the development of dynamic legged robots that run at body lengths per second at scales ranging from just a few centimeters in length up to multiple meters, like this latest Wildcat robot built in Boston Dynamics. And in robotic manipulation, robots have already proven themselves in factories in high-precision, repetitive assembly tasks. And they're beginning to transfer those skills to the home to perform domestic tasks like folding towels and washing dishes. And the future vision for this, laid out by the NSF's recent National Robotics Initiative, is collaborative robots that are working together with humans both in factories and in the home. In neuromechanics, there have been tremendous progress both in the basic science as well as applied biomechanics and kind of applications to human motor control. So in the fundamental biomechanics end, for instance, there are results, the one I'm highlighting here, this experiment with cockroaches running over rough surfaces was conducted by Simon Sponberg, who's in the audience over here. And they found some fundamental insights into the mechanisms that animals use to maintain stable gaits in complicated environments. So for instance, here it was shown that cockroaches don't even modify the activation pattern they're sending to their muscles to run over this very complicated and fractured terrain. They're relying instead on passive self-stabilization or mechanical self-stabilization mechanisms. And then in the more applied and human biomechanics end, we've developed prosthetic devices that enable paraplegics to perform at the highest level of human ability, competing in the Olympics. And we've also been developing, for instance, brain-computer interfaces that enable people who've never been able to move their limbs to use a robotic arm to perform useful tasks. And some of these techniques are even making their way into textbooks at this point. This is becoming fairly standard material now. And the vision for this, for instance, as a subset of the NIH's BRAIN initiative, is to develop personalized healthcare programs or personalized tools for healthcare for individuals. And then in the broader setting of cyber-physical systems, I'm showing here just a few slices that intersect my particular research interests. But for instance, we've seen a push toward automating the healthcare system, developing robotic surgeons or robotic assisted surgery, and that's made tremendously improved the surgical outcomes for a few specific kinds of surgery. And the potential in this area to do remote diagnosis and operation is tremendous as well. And then we've seen the rollout of both large-scale human-in-the-loop systems and large multi-physical, for instance, power generation and transportation infrastructure. And so the vision for this, and the NSF's been working on this for a while with their CPS program, is the simultaneous or the co-design of the cyber computational elements together with the underlying physical infrastructure, for instance, the grid or the transportation network. So as I've said, the future outlook for research in each of these areas is very bright, but there are some fundamental engineering challenges standing in our way of getting to that point. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them here. In robotics, the devices we build still require or rely on very careful calibration, and their performance tends to degrade in not a very graceful way, especially in dynamic or adversarial environments. In CPS, the sheer scale of both the temporal and spatial scales that the systems operate on, and the fact that they're often multi-agent and multi-physical, makes them difficult even to model, let alone analyze, synthesize, and verify. And then in neuromechanics, we've had great insights into particular tasks or in constrained laboratory-type environments, but it's proven difficult to generalize the insights across and between tasks, or more generally, across organisms that operate at vastly different scales or are comprised of very different materials or have different morphology or kind of the shape of their body. And so even though these three areas seem initially quite disparate and separate, I see in the challenges that I've chosen to highlight here a common thread, which is that in each area, what's standing in our way is the problem of engineering and analyzing the dynamic interaction between the computational and mechanical components in the system. So to go into a little bit more detail about what I mean by that, for instance, in robotics, the typical task is to design the controller and the sensing and actuation systems to interface through the body, the actual physical mechanism, with the objects and obstacles in the environment. In neuromechanics, we're often concerned with actually reverse engineering or going in the opposite direction. So starting from the ecological context or environment that the organism evolved in, using that to determine the constraints and the influences on body design that determines, and then going from that to try to infer something about what the sensor motor elements in the nervous system are doing to affect the motion that we see, or the behavior we see. And finally, in cyber-physical systems, we're really concerned with the simultaneous design or kind of going in both directions. So we need to design both these cyber or networked elements and their dynamic interaction with the underlying physical world or infrastructure that we're designing. And in each of these cases, I want to point out that the dynamics we're looking at are fundamentally non-classical. And by that I mean, for instance, they're piecewise defined or so-called hybrid dynamical models, or they're distributed over, again, large scales that don't always fit into the classical modeling paradigms. And so my assertion is that we need new tools and a new framework for both modeling and control in these systems. And so my work is targeted at developing and contributing to the analytical, computational, and experimental tools that let us investigate the dynamic interaction that I've highlighted in each of these areas. And so the common set of tools that I bring to bear on these problems are the techniques from control and dynamical systems theory, or kind of extending and developing new techniques from this area. And more than just solving isolated problems in these separate areas, I see these techniques as providing connections and potentially bridges, enabling us to translate results between domains. And I'll come back to this idea more at the end of my talk. And so specifically, I'm trying to develop this unified framework that lets us engineer these dynamic interactions that arise in all three settings between the computational and mechanical elements in the system. And so what I'll focus on specifically today is a set of three key contributions I've made in these areas that pushed us toward a framework for systematically studying terrestrial or legged locomotion. So I'll focus on these two model systems, the cockroach and these small-scale legged robots. And I'll talk about three results. The first is a technique for extracting low-order models from more detailed models of these systems. The second is a scalable algorithm for estimating unknown parameters in these models. And then the third is basically enabling us to implement models on a computer and verify that we're actually accurately representing these abstract or analytical models in the digital computer so that we can, for instance, simulate and perform numerical calculations. And altogether, the way I see this pushing, and I'll describe this once I've talked about these three results, I see these altogether as kind of emerging from this a systems-level theory for neuromechanical systems, or this interaction between nervous systems or computational elements and the physical world. So to lay this out in a linear order, I'm going to begin with the motivation for how I got interested in this locomotion problem by describing some surprising phenomena that arise when we look at animal gaits and the motion of animals. And then I'll go through these three key results on model reduction, system identification, and numerical simulation. And finally, I'll conclude with some ideas for future directions in research in these areas. So to begin with, one observation you can make is that though we've made tremendous progress building robots that perform at high capacity, like I showed in the introduction, the performance of robots in most contexts still pales in comparison to that of animals in similar situations. So I'm going to show a sequence of videos that are all from Dan Goldman's lab at Georgia Tech, recent work from there, that kind of highlight this. So if we take a robot whose gait and whose design was optimized for hard level terrain, and we throw it in a new environment, on a flowing, fluidized, granular media, in this case it's poppy seeds, but you could imagine like a sandy beach or a muddy field or something, then the performance of that robot will often be very poor. So in this case, the robot really just spins its legs and it kind of stays stuck. It makes slow progress, but not very impressive. But then if we do kind of careful study, as Goldman's group did, and we carefully characterize the environment or the solidification effects that occur in this granular media, and we optimize the gait to take that into account, then we can significantly improve the performance of the robot in that particular context. But even that behavior, the performance level, the level of ability, still doesn't even compare to that of an animal that evolved in an ecological context that had this sort of flowing granular substrate. And so it's clear that the animals have design principles embodied in them and control principles that we don't yet understand, that we're not able to engineer into our devices. And so I'm interested in trying to extract those principles from the animal behaviors so that we can engineer better systems. And so if you kind of focus on what animals are doing, there's actually a lot of surprising phenomena their gaits exhibit that might suggest some of the mechanisms that are enabling their performance. So for instance, if I just take data from a running cockroach, which I have here, and I just look at the fore-aft foot position of all of 6 legs in the center of mass reference frame, and I plot that versus time, as you're seeing in the middle plot here, then you see a highly regular structure emerge. And indeed, if I just rescale the time axis by % progress through stride, and I get the plot on the far right, this is a gait phase statistic, then I see an almost periodic structure emerge. It's very striking. And so indeed, if I just were to estimate that single statistic as a function of time, this gait phase, I could reproduce or predict to high accuracy the entire mechanical configuration of the whole animal. And if I further refined this model and I added on extra dimensions and accounted for more of the variation that I'm seeing in my data set, then I could arrive at a more accurate model and at some point reach kind of diminishing returns in terms of my ability to predict what's happening. I essentially capture all of the behavior of the system. And so this was actually carefully conducted by a colleague and collaborator of mine, Shai Revzin, recently. And what they showed is that these cockroach dynamics, when they're running just on a hard ground with no obstructions or anything, are approximately 7-dimensional. This is really surprising, given that the animals have more than 7 mechanical degrees of freedom in every limb. So there's a huge degree of dimensionality loss and kind of intrinsic reduction happening in these animal gaits, and we don't really understand why that's happening. The mechanisms are partially understood, mostly at the level of neural synchronization or sort of muscle activation symmetries and synergies, or at the external environmental level, these solidification effects I mentioned that can make even granular media appear as firm and solid as hard level ground. But there still could be something in this dynamic interaction between the nervous system and the external environment. And so this is exactly the area that I'm focusing on and that I'll present in this talk. And so what the evidence together suggests, though, the fact that the animals have this low-dimensional behavior, is that it should be possible to describe their behavior using a mathematical model of significantly reduced order, literally on the order of 10 states. And if this were possible, if I could use this model, this framework was proposed by Full and Koticek about 15 years ago. In particular, what they said is that this low-dimensional model shouldn't only reproduce the sort of average or steady-state behavior of the physical system, but moreover, it should accurately predict the system's response to perturbations and parameter variations. If this were true, if I could find a reduced order model with on the order of 10 states that accurately predicted the behavior of a physical system as complicated as a cockroach or a small-scale robot, this would be an extremely powerful technique for studying the systems, because I could effectively reduce questions regarding design or control to the equivalent questions in the simplified mathematical model. And because the model is so simple, I could completely analyze it, either by pen and paper or just exhaustive numerical experiments. I could solve my design or my control problem and lift the solution back up this hierarchy into the original physical system. But clearly, there are some significant gaps that remain to actually operationalize this idea and apply it to any particular physical system. So in particular, any mathematical model we make, no matter how detailed, is always an approximation of the underlying physical world. And so necessarily, we have to go through some process by which we associate the model with data collected from the physical system and validate its behavior. And secondly, once I have a high-dimensional, detailed mathematical model that I think is reproducing the behavior I'm seeing, I need some systematic techniques to actually extract from it and distill it down to one of these simplified reduced-order models. And so what I'll talk about in the next two sections are techniques I've developed to fill in gaps in these two diagrams. I'll start by talking about a model reduction tool that applies broadly to periodic phenomena or periodic gates for this class of models. And I'll show how that reduced-order model that we extract enables us to implement a scalable algorithm to solve this parameter identification problem in this context. But then neither of these techniques will be of much use if we can't actually computationally investigate this on a computer in practice. And so the third main contribution I'll talk about is to provably converge a numerical simulation for this class of models as well, which was an outstanding problem in the broader context of these cyber-physical systems. And there's been significant prior work in all of these areas. In particular, in the model reduction problem for simplified subclasses of models, either Lagrangian systems or piecewise linear systems, there are techniques to do model reduction even for these hybrid systems. And then in system identification, again, there are techniques that have been developed, but for restricted classes of systems. And keep in mind that the models that we're interested in are sort of piecewise defined. Every time a different subset of legs come on and off the terrain, there's a different set of governing differential equations, literally Newton's laws, that correspond to that contact configuration. So my dynamics are changing discontinuously in time. So a lot of the classical techniques no longer apply. And the techniques that have been developed for this switching or hybrid paradigm are limited to piecewise linear, which isn't really applicable in this regime because as animals sort of pivot pendulum-like over their stance limbs, nonlinearities arise everywhere, basically. And then in the context of simulation, there had been an algorithm proposed, and I'll get into some of the details about why that doesn't apply to this class of models in general as well. So to begin, I'm going to focus on this model reduction problem, and specifically finding a technique that enables model reduction to happen near periodic orbits in a broad class of models for locomotion. So the initial example that I want you to have in mind, and kind of I'll refer to throughout my talk this vertical hopper example to illustrate the concepts and the results and the techniques that I'm presenting. I want you to keep in mind that this is not the only model I can apply these techniques to. It's just the one that makes it easy to explain, and I think there's rich intuition there. So this model consists of two masses that move vertically in a gravitational field, and between them they have a spring and an actuator. And so if I drive the actuator with kind of a periodic input, then the system settles into a sort of periodic steady state hopping motion like you see. And I should point out that the model here is that when the foot strikes the ground, it instantaneously dissipates all of its kinetic energy. So it's a perfectly plastic mechanical impact. You can think about, when my foot actually strikes the ground, it doesn't sort of ricochet off in an elastic way. It actually like sticks and deforms and kind of adheres to the substrate. And so there's already something interesting happening in this model that you might not have thought of the first time you saw it, which is an interesting kind of sort of dimensionality loss that appears to be happening. So if I imagine the state space for this system in the air mode and in the ground mode, then I get a picture that looks kind of like this that I'm trying to illustrate this way. In the air mode, when the foot is off the ground, there are two mechanical degrees of freedom. And so the system is four-dimensional that I've sort of illustrated with the three-dimensional looking tube up there, so you'll have to bear with me on the visualizing four-dimensional spaces here. But then when it's in the ground mode, when the foot is on the ground, it's at zero height and zero velocity. So I can effectively kind of remove it from my state momentarily, and I can just think about the one mechanical degree of freedom that remains in the body mass. In which case, that bottom patch, that two-dimensional sheet there, is actually an accurate picture of the two-dimensional state space in that mode. And when the system's doing this periodic hopping type motion, it's cycling back and forth between these two regimes. So if I think about a periodic motion here, and I think about initializing a volume of initial conditions in that unconstrained air domain, there's two mechanical degrees of freedom, so there are four dimensions that volume takes up. And then as I flow it around one cycle, when all of those initial conditions reach the ground domain, then this new constraint appears and they flatten down to a two-dimensional sheet kind of volume. But then because the model is deterministic, when I keep on propagating and those initial conditions return back to their air domain, they can't regain the dimension that was lost or the dimensions that were lost. So they're still constrained to being on a two-dimensional subset of the full four-dimensional space. So already, if you can imagine this, in this thought experiment, there's already some kind of hint of dimensionality loss appearing, even in this very simplified mechanical model. So it's exactly this route to dimension or model reduction that I'm going to significantly generalize and formalize in the remainder of this section. So to do that, I need to build up just a little bit of mathematical notation. So the class of models that we're interested in are these hybrid dynamical systems. You can think of this just as comprised of disjoint, regular, ordinary differential equations on subsets of Euclidean space. That's kind of what I have illustrated here. So I have D1 and D2. You could think of those as just two different versions of some Euclidean space. And on each of them, I have a differential equation, x dot equals f of x, f1 or f2. But then I also have these rules or these regions where I switch between the two domains. When my foot strikes the ground, then I actually jump to a different regime or a different space. And so if I think about the dynamics for these systems, starting from some initial condition x0, I basically solve the continuous time ODE until I collide with one of these guarded regions indicated by the g's here, at which point my trajectory is instantaneously reset to the new domain, and I continue flowing as before. Just a little bit of notation I'm going to need later on in my talk is I will let phi denote the flow for the system. So phi of t comma x0 is the point on the trajectory that starts at x0 after it's gone forward for t time units. And we'll be particularly interested in periodic trajectories in this class of systems because those model in a canonical way the periodic gaits of animals, at least in their center of mass reference frame. And so a periodic trajectory here is just going to be one of these trajectories that eventually folds back on itself and just continues cycling around, repeating the same path over and over again. So whenever that happens, I'm going to denote that by gamma, and that'll be how I refer to periodic orbits. So to study the dynamics near these periodic orbits, I'm going to use a tool that was actually originally developed for classical ordinary differential equation dynamical systems called a Poincare map. So if you haven't seen this construction before, I'm going to quickly go through it. The idea is that I start with a section, which is a hypersurface that passes through the periodic orbit and intersects it at exactly one point, c in this diagram. And then I define a map that takes me from sigma and kind of integrates the dynamics forward and sums up the cumulative effect of flowing around one cycle and then flowing back into this surface sigma again. So formally, I start from some initial condition x0 in the section, and then I solve this trajectory forward in time until it collides with this surface again. And I use that to define my Poincare map P at the initial condition x0. So if you've never seen this construction before, you might be your mathematical sense might be kind of tingling a little bit. You might be wondering whether this even gives a well-defined mathematical object or whether it has any reasonable properties at all, continuity, differentiability, et cetera. But it turns out that for the models that we're interested in, under some fairly mild assumptions, and this has been known since the 50s by the Soviets, that this map defined in this way is actually smooth. It's differentiable in a neighborhood of the fixed point c. Note that if I were to evaluate the Poincare map at c, I would just get that point back because that's on the orbit. It just intersects that point again. So this map is actually well-defined even in this hybrid setting. So now we can use this to try to study the dynamics near this orbit. But here's something that happens in hybrid systems that cannot happen in classical systems, which is that as we iterate this map, it actually turns out that under certain conditions that I'll describe formally in a moment, its image will collapse onto a subset of this section sigma, so the subset S, and it will continue to impact that set S. It will basically restrict to that for all forward time. And so if we started with that set S and we flow it forward in time, it will sweep out this subsystem indicated by the M's here, these blue sheets in my model. And the dynamics will effectively be confined to that subset of the space for all forward time. So to put this a little more formally, the theorem says that if n bounds the minimum dimension of all the domains of my system, and if I iterate this Poincare map, and I take its Jacobian linearization, that's what the dPn there is, it's just the familiar matrix derivative. And if that, as I iterated this map n times, if that's a constant rank matrix near this fixed point, then all initial conditions that start sufficiently close to this periodic orbit will contract to a collection of subspaces that all have the same dimension. They're r+1 dimensional. And they're actually invariant under the continuous flow. They're integral submanifolds in the lingo of dynamical systems. But basically, you don't flow out of them. You basically they're invariant under that, the vector field. And also, when I reach the boundaries, basically, when I restrict R to this subset, I actually end up back in one of these subsets as well. So what this means is that I can actually pull this subset out, and I can use it to define a new hybrid dynamical system that contains the original periodic orbit gamma. And in fact, this reduced order system controls the behavior of the original system, at least in the sense that this periodic orbit is asymptotically stable in the reduced system, if and only if it's asymptotically stable in the original. So now returning to this initial example that I talked about, that the thought experiment suggested there was some kind of dimensionality loss type phenomena happening, we can actually formalize it here. So here it turns out that the periodic, or that the Poincare map, the section that we're defining this over, is one-dimensional. So this Jacobian linearization is literally just the slope of a tangent line at a certain point. And it's non-zero, which means that as we iterate it, it will continue to be non-zero. So we automatically satisfy this constant rank type condition. And so I can directly infer from the theorem that this 2-degree freedom mechanical system reduces or loses one of its mechanical degrees of freedom after a single hop. I think this result is a little counterintuitive, so let me tell you my kind of best interpretation of it at the moment. Because it's not the case that I could simply go in now and erase the lower mass and, from my equations and have never thought about it at all. It's important that it's there to faithfully represent this system. But I think what is happening is that the holonomic kind of unilateral constraint that appears when the foot is on the ground essentially persists implicitly even after liftoff, in the sense that if I know the system has gone through one of these ground modes and then it's back in the air, if you tell me the position and velocity of the upper mass, there's a unique position and velocity the lower mass must have subject to that information. So really there's an implicit constraint there, and there are fewer mechanical degrees of freedom than existed originally in the system. And just to show you that we're not constrained to only applying it to vertical hopping, so I can take a model for locomotion. Yeah, Eric, you have a question on the previous slide. Yeah.
If I change the control law from sine sigma t to something else, do I get a different submanifold?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll repeat the question. The question was, if I change the input or the feedback control law that I'm using to drive my actuation, do I get a different reduced system? The answer in general is yes. And so I'll address this question again on the next slide as well when I talk about a more interesting example. In this particular example, the answer is no, because the dimension loss here is really due to one of the modes that I'm intermittently going through having a lower dimension. So I'm not losing any, I'm only being constrained by the space that the system goes through. So in that case, as long as I know that whatever feedback law you're applying, as long as I know I'm going through that ground domain, and it's not a time-varying feedback law, it's closed loop, then, in this case, it's not. Right? But for instance, I can use this insight in order to remove a lot of degrees of freedom from a system. So for instance, I can imagine a simple model that looks like the following. It's a hockey puck, an ellipsoidal hockey puck that scurries around in the plane, and it has n legs attached to it with springs and actuators, whatever you want to have. And the important point is that there's mass in all of the feet of these limbs. So I'm putting, rather than like a massless spring leg, I'm putting a little bit of mass in the foot. And my modeling assumption here, this is just an artificial model to illustrate the technique, is that I can pick up or touch down the foot at any point in time. I have complete control over that. So I can attach or detach the foot at any time. Then as long as I have actuation both at the hip, kind of rotating, and prismatically along the shank, this is still an under-actuated system. It has under-actuation of degree 3, so it's not totally trivial. And by careful choice of the state feedback law for those actuators, I can completely reduce that system on the left to a model that's been studied a lot in the literature called the lateral leg spring that's just 3 degrees of freedom, and all it has is a single massless spring leg. So here the important point that Eric already hit on is that here I had to carefully design my state feedback law in order to get this reduction to occur. And in fact, if I replaced it with a different state feedback law, or if I perturbed the state feedback law I had, then this sort of exact reduction phenomena wouldn't occur, generically in this case. What does happen generically, and the details are in this archive preprint, it's a recent submission that we have, is that another type of reduction happens. There's an approximate reduction that occurs, even in that case. So for anybody that's interested in that, I'd be really happy to talk about that more after the talk. But that's a great question. So to conclude this section, I want to point out that basically we have this technique for model reduction that shows that models for periodic gates in this class of hybrid systems generically reduce their dimensionality. This is this topic I was talking about right at the end. So now I want to move on to show how this reduced order structure can be used to implement scalable parameter identification algorithms for this class of systems. So just to remind you, the kind of problem that we want to try to solve is we have these interesting physical systems, cockroaches and robots, that are executing rhythmic behaviors in the environment, running across the ground or on a treadmill. And what we want to do is take a mathematical model and tune the free parameters for the model to best reproduce the behavior of the physical system that we can. And so specifically, the formalism that we use to do this is prediction error minimization or expectation maximization. And so just to get an initial start on this problem, we try the kind of blunt approach of just saying, okay, let's assume that I have a model for a physical system. Again, I'm just using vertical hopping as an illustration here. That I can simulate my model and observe it, so that's this y function giving me observations, for instance, position or height of center of mass as a function of time. And I'm going to assume in this identification setup that the data I'm getting from my physical system are noisy observations of simulations from my actual model from some unknown initial condition z star. So then what I'm going to do is choose some error function that basically just measures the discrepancy between the observations I get from my simulation or my model and from my physical system, and I'm going to search over the state space and the parameter space in order to minimize this prediction error. This is a very blunt approach, but it turns out to be hard to solve even this version of the problem, let alone more refined further techniques we'd like to develop. And the assumption I'm going to impose, just to make the problem remotely tractable, is that these observations should be smooth functions of time, so they should be smooth along the trajectories. So for instance, this is pretty reasonable in the context of locomotion because I'll typically attach motion capture features to the trunk of an animal or a robot. And so those data at a high level of accuracy will evolve fairly smoothly in time. And I should point out here, so I'm saying identification of initial conditions. Because in this setup, the dynamics are deterministic, if there are free parameters that I'm interested in fitting as well, for instance, mass distributions and leg stiffness properties and things like that, I can incorporate those into the state with trivial dynamics and then reduce the problem to the setup I'm giving here. So I just want to say that the technique applies for parameter estimation as well, or instead, but just to make the notation and the formalism as simple as possible, I'm just talking about it as if they were part of the state. So then this problem, if I try to solve it, minimizing this prediction error over this whole hybrid state space, then this is really challenging to do in a sort of iterative prediction error minimization type framework, because it's not really possible to define the derivative of this prediction error. It's not obvious how to do so on the boundaries or the switching instance between the different domains. And even if I did, and I was trying to run an iterative procedure, it's not obvious how I would jump backward through one of these non-invertible reset maps. So basically, when my foot strikes the ground, all of the information about what velocity it had immediately before it hit the ground is lost. And so if I was trying to estimate a parameter and I needed to jump backward through that transition, it's not obvious how I would do that. So my claim is that, in general, I'll have to resort to global optimization techniques for these systems that scale very poorly with the dimension of the state space. If we instead restrict our attention to the reduced order structure that we know generically shows up in these models of locomotion, then in fact this reduced subsystem has very special structure that enables us to define what we mean by the gradient of the prediction error even on these boundaries. And in particular, the key property that we're exploiting here is that these reset maps actually become invertible when we restrict them to this subsystem. And so now we can implement scalable first-order gradient descent type methods in order to solve this problem. So now that we have the algorithm, I want to just describe kind of ongoing work that I'm conducting applying this to these two application domains of robotics and biomechanics or neuromechanics. So in the first one, we're interested in understanding how some of the mechanisms that animals are using to recover from large perturbations. And so we've known from previous experiments that if you really perturb an animal that, with a large and abrupt mechanical perturbation, that the recovery will be largely mediated by the mechanical system. So for instance, here, a cockroach, in an experiment that I'm involved in, a cockroach is running on a cart that's going to accelerate to the right. The bottom plot is velocity of the cart versus time. So now the cart is accelerating, and the animal's responding. And we showed in a previous paper that appeared in Biological Cybernetics last year that, in fact, the neural system really isn't kicking in for multiple strides following the onset of this perturbation. So my idea is to use by fitting a reduced order model to the pre-perturbation animal motion, we can use that as sort of a null hypothesis for how we can actually use this in a predictive way. We can perturb our model, and the discrepancy between how the model responds and how the animal responds will give us some indication about what the neural system is doing once it kicks in. And then in the context of robotics, the project that I've been most intimately involved in involves developing small-scale legged robots. So small scale means like palm size, like 10 centimeters long. And in this scale, it's very challenging to, the big constraint that you have is that you can't pack it full of actuators and power sources the way you can at larger scales. You can't put, for instance, Big Dog uses like a lawnmower engine. We can't do that on these small-scale robots. We're limited to a very small cell phone battery. And so it's important to get the most you can out of all of the actuators you have. And so my collaborator, Aaron Hoover, who's now at Olin College, came up with a very clever mechanical design where he used a single DC motor to drive 6 or more legs in synchrony in an alternating tripod kind of cockroach-like gait. But the problem is that that robot could only run straight. So we needed some way to introduce the ability to turn left or right. And so drawing on some inspiration from models that were developed to model animal turning, we realized that if we just introduce asymmetric leg stiffness changes, if we just stiffen the leg on one side or the other of the robot, it should turn. So we did some initial experiments that appeared in a conference paper where we physically swapped out the stiffer leg on one side or the other, and we got fairly consistent turning results. So now what we want to do is actually integrate actuated stiffening or active stiffening using these muscle wires in the legs, and then use one of these reduced order models that are fit to the physical robot to actually optimize the turning, the kind of control input we put into the actuator to optimize the turning. So the takeaway from this parameter identification section is that the model reduction scheme that we developed enables us to implement a scalable algorithm for estimating unknown parameters in these models of locomotion. So now I'd like to move on and describe this third key contribution in the area of numerical simulation of hybrid systems. So the systems that we're interested in, I've kind of already illustrated them, but I'm going to give you a more broad kind of context. These hybrid control systems arise all over the place, not just in locomotion. Whenever you have distinct operating modes, and these can either be physical dynamical regimes like we encounter with locomotion and manipulation. You know, the dynamics of me reaching for a cup and then grasping it are different once I've actually grasped it. But this could also arise from, for instance, a digital controller state, an on-off in your thermostat, or a more complicated automata in some kind of embedded system. And so the important point here is that the state space for these systems is really comprised of these distinct and incompatible operating modes. So there's like a continuous domain for every different mode I can be in, and they are not directly related to one another. And this kind of gives us a couple of obstacles in looking at distance and simulation that we don't have in classical differential equation systems in Rn. So in Rn, or in Euclidean space, we naturally inherit a distance metric, almost magically, that's induced by the norm that comes from the vector space structure. So if I have 2 points x and y, I just take the norm of x minus y, and that gives me a distance for those 2 points, whatever norm you want to choose. Similarly, there's a problem that's very simple to solve in classical ODE systems of simulation, which is that I do the simplest possible algorithm that you could think of, forward Euler, where starting from my current state, xk, to determine the next state, xk plus 1, I just evaluate my vector field f at my current state, and then I just move some fraction h, this is the time step, in that direction. So this very straightforward scheme turns out to have very nice formal properties. It converges uniformly with a linear rate of convergence, which is really, really nice for deriving further results. But in this hybrid setting, we actually don't really have either of these things naturally. So if I have 2 points x and y that are in distinct modes, it's not at all obvious how to assign a non-infinite distance between them. And if I just decide to go with the trivial distance metric that assigns infinite distance to points in distinct modes, then I can't really do a lot with that computationally. I can't put an infinity on my computer, really. And then similarly with simulation, I could be in a domain, but because I have these guarded regions or these transition surfaces, for instance, when a foot strikes the ground, the naive forward Euler would actually potentially have me taking an integration step and exiting my domain completely. And it's not obvious how to get around this effect. So we addressed both of these basic problems and provided a construction of a distance metric that applies to these hybrid control systems and a convergent numerical simulation algorithm. So the construction for the distance metric, it's motivated again by this property that states in different modes don't seem to be directly comparable. But what we can do is think about, they are related in some sense because we have these resetting or switching maps that are taking us between domains. And so what I can do is actually use this reset map to take these two spaces, D1 and D2, these two distinct modes, and I can perform surgery. I can put mathematical glue and take a topological quotient and stick them together to become a new space over which I can define a distance metric that gives me finite distances between all pairs of points. So this is our distance metric construction. And what this enables us to do is actually prove that that naive or simple forward Euler scheme that I described does actually converge for this class of hybrid systems. So the basic problem with simulation when we have these boundaries or these events that are occurring is that the simulation algorithm will inevitably introduce some error in approximating exactly when the trajectory crosses the event surface, exactly when does my foot strike the ground. And so any algorithm must control the error introduced by this event detection subroutine. And so what we did is we said, OK, allow yourself to make some error. So basically attach extra space, again using a topological quotient, to your this original thing that was just like a shield blocking you from exiting the domain. Now just add a little region that your simulation can land on. and then control the error by increasing or decreasing the size of that region that you actually stick to. And so what we show is that actually if you just implement straightforward forward Euler, that this will converge, again, uniformly with a linear rate of convergence, which is the result that we had in the classical setting, for any orbitally stable execution, which is a technical term I'd be happy to talk about in more detail offline, but it basically, any reasonable trajectory for your system will be approximated by this algorithm. So the conclusion from this section is that we have this convergent numerical simulation algorithm for this broad class of hybrid control systems that we can use as a foundation to build on more elaborate tools like for optimization and synthesis. And so pulling these three contributions together and filling in this diagram that I introduced at the beginning of my talk, I think what we're really on the verge of is developing a systems level understanding or a systems theory for these neuromechanical systems governing locomotion and even manipulation. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done that I'm very interested in doing, and kind of ongoing and future work. I'm interested in filling in the other gaps in this diagram, in particular in reversing the direction of some of these arrows. So taking simple models and robustly embedding them, which actually partially addresses Eric's question about the sensitivity or the robustness of the model reduction process, in a higher dimensional, more detailed and faithful representatives. And then actually using those detailed models to synthesize control inputs and feedback laws for real physical systems like robots to get them to perform new tasks. And so putting this back in the context of this original picture I drew, I really think that these three results are providing strong connections between what initially seemed like different or unrelated disparate domains. So for instance, I think that originally I was motivated to look at this model reduction phenomena by observations that were being made in biomechanics and neuromechanics. But now that we have this new formal tool that enables us to synthesize feedback laws that do reduction in robotic systems, now we have a new idea about a mechanism animals may be using, neuromechanical systems may be using to simplify their dynamics. So it goes both ways, basically. And I think the connections are strong as well between these other areas in terms of translating fundamental tools for metrization and simulation back and forth between these domains, and developing techniques for data-driven modeling that apply both to specifically the neuromechanical systems I'm interested in, but also the broader class of cyber-physical systems that contain them. And so what I'm working on in ongoing work, and I just want to give you kind of a brief overview of where I see this going, a few more projects I'm doing that I think continue to fill in this overall picture in these connections and strengthen the connections between these areas. So in robotics, I've been motivated by some spectacular results from some of my collaborators, Aaron Johnson and Dan Koticek at Penn, in a recent ICRA paper, where they took their six-legged breadbox-sized robot called Rex, XREX in this case, and by carefully hand-tuning the inputs to all of the legs, they were able to get it to execute these spectacular dynamic maneuvers. But the important observation here is that if I took this robot and I put it outside on unlevel ground or with a rock height, a ledge height that was slightly different than what you see in this video, then this behavior would probably fail. And so then we'd have to go through, for that particular environment, we'd have to take Aaron back out into the field to take careful measurements and do careful hand tuning and use his deep mechanical insight in order to synthesize a new behavior appropriate for that context. But it's clear that if we want our robots to be behaving in the real physical world, that we need them to be able to synthesize those behaviors automatically, possibly extremizing some performance criterion or doing this optimally in some sense. But this is a very challenging problem because the kind of first thing you might think to do is you might think, okay, well, I will just think about how I'm going to place and where and when I'm going to place every one of my feet and in what sequence, and plan in this discrete kind of combinatorial contact sequence space. The problem with that is that explodes really quickly in dimension, and so that's actually kind of intractable to do the path planning over that space. And so our insight, and I've presented some preliminary results in this direction at a recent biology meeting, is that if we just take a step back and we realize that this is a physical system, if I plug in a continuous input, for instance, to all of the motors, it will result in some discrete sequence, but I can just directly try to do my optimization over that continuous space where I have scalable tools. And we might be able to automatically synthesize these type of spectacular maneuvers. In neuromechanics, I've been very interested in another surprising phenomena that shows up in animal gaits, which is that animals often use gaits wherein multiple limbs hit the ground at almost exactly the same time. So for instance, I have here a video of a horse trotting. You also sometimes see dogs trotting or pacing. And what's surprising about this is surprising for a few reasons. So first of all, there's some theoretical work that suggests that it's less energetically efficient to have two limbs hit the ground at the same time than sort of space your footfalls out equally in time. So it's surprising for that reason. It also seems like a very challenging control target to hit. I have to get two legs to hit the ground at exactly the same time. And so if there wasn't some pressure on the animal, if there wasn't some reward that it was getting from doing that, some benefit, it seems unlikely that the nervous system would have evolved to execute that gait. And so we've started looking at some simplified models for the sort of impact mechanics that happen when limbs strike the ground, as you're seeing in this video. And by developing these and analyzing these simple models, we've uncovered what we think of it as a novel route to stability, or novel mechanism for stability in these multi-legged gaits that actually makes these simultaneous touchdown events attracting and exert a net stabilizing effect on the overall center of mass dynamics. So we're really interested in seeing to what extent, trying to actually test whether animals may be using this mechanism and seeing to what extent this can be translated to improve the design of robot gaits. And finally, in the broader class of cyber-physical systems, I've talked a lot about parameterized models that have been developed by other groups and myself through kind of carefully looking at a physical system and trying to really deeply understand the basic mechanical components that we should incorporate into a parsimonious reduced order model. But if we want to actually get our devices out in the real world in environments they've never seen before, we need them to actually extract those models on their own. And so what we proposed in a recent IFAC paper that will appear in the IFAC World Congress this summer is to actually think about deriving directly from data these piecewise defined, in this case we restricted our attention to piecewise affine models, piecewise defined models for physical systems, and then subsequently use that model to synthesize inputs to control the system. So we applied this directly to locomotion, the locomotion problem in this paper. I think there's immediate extensions that are applicable to manipulation problems and possibly things like robotic surgery and other kinds of fine manipulation tasks where the dynamics in your environment or like the tissue properties or the properties of the objects you're interacting with are changing. You might want to estimate a model. And then similarly, in situations where you have a lot of agents, like a lot of wind farms, and a lot of dynamic interaction between the switching modes that the individual agents are making, you might want those individual agents to be able to estimate models for their dynamics that are also in this piecewise defined kind of hybrid class of models as well. And I'm interested in ongoing work in pursuing those kinds of extensions. So finally, just returning to this, this overall diagram, I hope that I've convinced you I'm working toward developing these analytical, computational, and experimental tools that taken together may eventually lead us toward a unified framework for modeling and control, and in particular, the ability to engineer the dynamic interaction between computation and mechanics. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, so we have time for questions from the audience. I have a question. Eric.
So in the last part where you're doing the adaptive inverse modeling,
right.
So I assume that the noise, the data you would get would have lots of noise and uncertainty in it.
Right.
How do you deal with that when making what looks like a very crisp and clean dynamical model?
Sort of model. Yeah, that's a valid question. So let me repeat the question. In the last slide that I showed, I talked about, or the second to last slide I showed, I talked about trying to derive the kinds of models that I'd been describing, these piecewise defined models, directly from experimental data, which is inevitably noisy, and there should be process noise and things like that. So what we're relying on here are techniques from classical linear system identification that are known to be robust to the kinds of noise that you're talking about. And the underlying model that we want to ultimately obtain, we think it would be good to start with something deterministic so that we can synthesize inputs to actually get the system to behave how we want to. But because the kinds of models that we're fitting, these piecewise things, could fit into the kind of classic stochastic control context as well, we could also try to apply those techniques.
I guess it's just a question of like, you don't know where the boundaries are between the different domains yet.
Right.
And your models require that you know where those boundaries are in order to topologically glue them together. And therefore, that's the part that doesn't fit in the linear control systems part. You have to decide where those are, and those ought to be subject to some kind of, noise issues.
Yeah, I see. Sorry. So the refinement of the question is that it seems important, or it's very important to the results that I'm presenting, especially these topological quotients and other kinds of tricks I'm pulling, that we know exactly where the crisp boundaries are between domains in the system. So in fact, this is exactly why we want to use these piecewise defined class of models, but we're simultaneously estimating both the linear regimes, like the linear control system regimes, and estimating the transition between them. So for instance, in the case of, the motivation for this, again, is that any model is always going to be an approximation. It isn't true that there is one mode where my foot is in the air and one mode where it's on the ground. But I may be able to reproduce to high precision the trajectory data I'm getting from, for instance, a locomoting system by fitting an appropriate boundary between distinct regions in the state space. And I guess I'll refine this as well to say that in this particular case, we're starting with observations that let us simultaneously fit. We're basically partitioning one state space as opposed to fitting totally disconnected and disjoint regions. So when we fit a surface right now, that already cleanly has the kind of attachment between adjacent domains.
Any more questions?
So in your question, you gave in your presentation, you gave the model reduction, right? Mm-hmm. From the higher order to low in the running. Although the model is reduced, what happens to the information dynamics? You didn't talk about that. Because let's say I'm running, the surface is not necessarily flat. So I continuously have that information that is varying. What about the dynamics of that?
No, that's a fantastic question. So if I can rephrase, and correct me if I misinterpret it, the way that I'd like to rephrase this is by pointing out that real physical locomotion by an animal or robot is not periodic. It's not truly periodic. There's either intrinsic variation in muscle fatigue that leads to non-periodicity, or there's external variations in terrain or obstacles or visual information. Is this an appropriate reinterpretation? OK. So this is a fantastic observation. And in fact, I know this. I know that gaits are not periodic. For instance, if you collect data from a human or an animal running for hours on a treadmill, then you'll see over short time scales, on the time scale of like tens or even hundreds of strides, you can sort of average and get a very accurate average gait for that physical system. But if you try to average it over hours of data, as the person's fatiguing, they'll continue to run effectively and effectively at the same speed. But they'll make small adjustments. They'll recruit different combinations of muscles, and they'll change their posture. And so their gait will actually change. Their gait is not a single well-defined periodic object. And so you can see similar effects in robots. Even if the robot has the same control signal for hours and hours, its motors may heat up, and their dynamics may change. Its limbs viscoelastic effects may kick in, and their dynamics may change. So this is a universal property. So my response to this is that even though it's not truly the case that the underlying physical system is periodic, it's a good approximation in a lot of regimes. So for instance, if I know that the terrain is going to be flat, and it gives us a starting point to investigate the more interesting situations you're proposing, which exactly is what I'm interested in, which is irregular terrain or aperiodic maneuvers or other kinds of gaits like that. So it's exactly the direction we want to move in, and I think that basically we're just starting with what we can analyze now. Yeah. Right.
So, if I were to look at this model, what is your certification for your models?
Can you expand on what you mean by certification? Because I have a feeling it has a very verification sort of.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I was going without using the term. So, what are my guarantees that computationally, because from the control side, I see that you bring the models, but from the computational perspective, when I want to implement, I have a set of algorithms, and I want some guarantees. Right. What can you give me as guarantees from the real models?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a very hard question. So to rephrase, or to kind of repeat, can I provide formal guarantees about the accuracy of a model that I fit to data, or the reduced order model that I extract from it? This is a fair, reinterpretation. I think that's a very hard problem, and I adopt a very kind of empiricist viewpoint on this. That I don't know how I would truly verify a property of any physical system, or let alone the connection between a simple mathematical model and that physical system. And so what I would do is once I've kind of once I've extracted my reduced order model and fit it to the data, I would use that to generate new predictions and new situations, synthesize new controllers or new gates in the case of robots, or predict the response of animals to new classes of perturbations. And if my model fares well in these new experiments that I've derived, then I begin to convince myself that it's a reasonable abstraction. In some sense, I've dodged your question because I cannot, in that mindset, provide formal guarantees. But I think this is a fundamental problem that arises as well in the more general class of cyber-physical systems, where you can have a hope of verifying an Intel processor up until the point when a gamma ray comes in and flips a bit. So I think this is a fundamental problem even in these broader contexts, and I'm very interested in trying to understand that even here.
Question?
Yeah, so you seem to look at organisms and models that deal with many, many legs. So I'm wondering if you've considered how your methods might apply to bipedal type models, and whether you think your methods will have any utility in designing prosthetic systems for humans.
No, that's a fantastic question. So just to repeat, I presented all of the work that I've done so far has been focused on these small-scale, multi-legged organisms and robots, either cockroaches or these palm-sized robots. And the question is, do the results I present extend to, for instance, bipeds? And in particular, do I have anything to say to the folks that are doing rehabilitation research or design of prosthetic and assistive devices? In fact, I do think that there's tremendous potential for application in those areas. In particular, the theoretical results that I presented are general in the sense that to the extent that the behavior you want to, or the behavior that you want to assist in the human is like a periodic gait or a periodic motion, even like chopping, like cooking is a lot of periodic motions as well, then the techniques I'm presenting for model reduction and system identification apply directly. There's no extensions required. And the big difference in the case of applying these things to humans compared to, say, cockroaches is that the complexity of the motor system and the number of different tasks that the brain is performing at a given time and its ability to influence what, the physical behavior that's happening, the potential there is much larger. And so I think that there's a lot more work that has to be done in the extension to incorporating the neural elements that are happening and adaptation that's happening in the humans. And I'm very interested in that line of work as well.
Any more questions? Okay, well then, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.